Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another one of the Center for Latin American Studies speaker series. I am Manuel Roman Lacayo. I'm the Associate Director for the Center. It is my pleasure once again to introduce you to today's speaker, Dr. Eduardo Elena. He specializes in the history of 19th and 20th century Latin America, and he has a particular interest in the societies of the South Atlantic region. He is Uruguayan, as we spoke earlier, which was, I only found out today, in fact. I thought he was Argentinian all along. Sorry for that.
Oh.
He received his degrees from the University of Virginia and Princeton University, where he got his master's and PhD. And he regularly teaches on capitalism and global consumption, the Cold War in the Americas, Latin American political and social history. His first book, Dignifying Argentina, Peronism, Citizenship, and Mass Consumption, was awarded the 2013 Book Prize for the Social Sciences by the Southern Home Studies section of the Latin American Studies Association. He also deals with Western expansionism and the social worlds of money in Argentina and Europe, especially Britain, during the second half of the 19th century. He engages with the scholarship of informal empire, as well as internal colonialism and finance capitalism. And his projects, the most recent project, tends to provide a new historical perspective on our contemporary fascination with rising countries in the global South. And you might have noticed that there's a coincidence in terms of today's title for the presentation. And before I hand this over to Dr. Elena, I would like for Ariel Armani, the Vice Chancellor for Global Affairs, to also share a few words with us.
Thank you, Manuel. It's a pleasure to see you here for another lecture organized by the Center for Latin American Studies. This is very, very, very dear to me, Eduardo's presence. We were colleagues at the University of Miami when I was there before coming to Pitt, and we worked together when I was the director of the Miami Institute for Advanced Studies of the Americas. Eduardo is a phenomenal colleague, great mentor and teacher, and we had a lot of fun working together. It was really, really great. So I'm very, very happy that you are here. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Manuel. Thank you, Ariel, for the kind introduction. Thanks for all of you for being here. And I know it's a rainy day. This time of the semester, as a colleague of mine used to call it, it's injury time, to use a soccer metaphor. So I really appreciate everyone being here. Also, thanks to Luz Amanda and Katie and everyone else at class and International Studies who took part in organizing my visit. Has gone off super smoothly so far. So without further ado, then I will present on this topic here. So while in the middle of a long tour across Europe in 1887, Julio Roca, the former president of Argentina, reported back the following impressions in a letter to his brother. There are an infinite number of people who show the greatest interest for the Argentinian Republic, and there is so much enthusiasm to migrate and do business with our country that they look upon it like an El Dorado. God willing, we shall know how to continue affirming this credit and confidence. If we continue like this, as I have faith, within 10 years, we shall be a colossus. Now, the late 1880s were indeed a time of great changes in Argentina, during which the country became the world's fastest growing economy. Those familiar with its history will know that Roca was the president who laid the groundwork for this capitalist takeoff earlier in the decade. He was also the military leader responsible for one of the largest land grabs in modern Latin American history and the attempted genocide of several indigenous societies in the Pampas, Patagonian, and Chaco regions. His generation's push for growth on several simultaneous fronts, commercial, financial, demographic, territorial, placed Argentina on the front lines of an expansionist West in the 1870s and 1880s. It was what contemporaries like to call a rising country. They used that term back in this time period, or an El Dorado, in a nod to colonial visions of fabled riches from centuries earlier. These yearnings were not limited to Argentina. Across late 19th century and early 20th century Latin America, similar expansionist dreams captivated locals and foreigners alike. These actors sought natural resources like coffee and rubber, but commodities were just the start. If we want to talk about Argentine commodities, we could talk about things like wool, or a slightly later photograph, things like grain. So commodities, though, were just the start. There were profits to be made in supplying Latin Americans with imports, ranging from manufactured wares to modern essentials like coal. Tens of millions of foreigners relocated to the region, seeking opportunities, while overseas capitalists and their local allies looked to profit from investments in railway and shipping companies, banks, and communication systems, among other areas of endeavor. In the Caribbean basin, these forms of economic expansion were accompanied by US military intervention and other varieties of political imperialism. Elsewhere, the asymmetrical relationships of informal empire were more the norm. The story does not end here. If Roca's Rhapsody of Growth sounded familiar to some of you, it's because similar drives are felt today in societies across the global South. The enthusiasm has shifted from Argentina to other rising countries, and Western agents have been joined by Eastern ones from nations like China. But businesses still comb through Latin America, Africa, and Asia to extract resources, while envisioning their burgeoning populations and fast-paced economies as generators of potential riches. Today, we use the language of emerging markets to describe these ambitions. Then as now, wealth-seeking appetites have left their mark on vast swaths of the world. Who then led the expansionist charge in late 19th century Argentina? How were expectations of growth cultivated and contested? And what were conditions on the ground like for people confronting the upheavals of a rising country? These are some of the questions that animate my current book project on steam age expansionism in Argentina and the Western world. Its title, Emerging El Dorado, serves as a bridge between the language of growth employed in the past and in our current age. My manuscript traces the circulation of two essential elements of expansion in Argentina, information and money, through different social levels and across different geographic spaces, from the financial hubs of Europe to the indigenous domains of the Pampas. In my presentation today, I'd like to share some of my findings, and in particular, introduce you to the methodologies and sources that I employ, right? This is the feature I want to highlight. I'm not going to go that in depth into historiographical issues, which might interest some in the audience, but I think sources and methodology would be one thing that might appeal to a broader audience. My book examines a wider cast of characters, I should say, than standard historical treatments of Argentina's takeoff. The ability to move between different social worlds, those inhabited by locals and foreigners, from groups at the top of the capitalist order to those at its margins, and people of different gender, class, national, and racial backgrounds, is one of my work's main contributions. The intent is to push at the boundaries of who and what gets considered worthy of attention in the study of economic life, while encouraging deeper reflection about the forms of power that shaped expansion in this period. Now, cramming the book's diverse dramatis personae into a short presentation is impossible, so in the time remaining, I will provide a snapshot of three sets of actors involved in the scramble for a rising Argentina, beginning with the most familiar and moving to the least expected. We shall start with the groups that I call the growth promoters, a loose alliance of locals and foreigners with the capital, connections, and authority needed to stoke Argentina's economic engines. We often equate Argentina's rise with the commodity export booms for which Latin America is famed. But one of the little secrets of the era's dominant models of expansion, which proponents understood full well at the time, even if later historians and commentators have tended to downplay, is that boosting growth depended as much, if not more so, on pulling resources into the country as sending them abroad. In Argentina, this meant drawing in more foreign investment, more imports, more know-how, and more people. My talk then turns to the main audiences for these promotional efforts, a no less diverse set of actors that we can call the fortune seekers. These included individuals who sought to make money from Argentinian ventures remotely as overseas investors, as well as migrants of varied means who relocated to the country to claim a share of this supposed El Dorado. As we shall see, some did indeed taste material success, but we can learn just as much about the lived experience of expansion from those that saw dreams frustrated. For the third set of actors, we shall invert these dominant perspectives to consider those living in the shadows of growth. These included members of the country's underclass, such as the native-born populations known as paisanos that inhabited rural zones. They were joined by immigrants who, by twists of luck, criminal inclinations, or an inability to conform to the rules, found themselves also on the margins. The denizens of these shadowlands pursued their own money-making tactics, seeking a measure of freedom and to preserve alternative ways of being. Some preyed on the vulnerabilities inherent in a rapidly changing society and the forms of wealth amassed by expansionist interests. In the concluding remarks, I will suggest further how these different actors were interconnected before offering parting observations on the relevance of this historical moment to our own growth-related predicaments. Okay, so to state an obvious if fundamental truth, no one group controlled the forces of growth in Argentina or elsewhere. From the 1860s onward, many hands contributed to its gathering momentum, not least the laboring people who produced valued things, built infrastructure, and performed essential tasks for the reproduction of society. An ever-fluctuating natural world helped to determine what could and could not be done, as did human-made crises of various forms. And yet, certain interest groups had the greatest say in setting the course for an ascending Argentina. The influence of these growth promoters stemmed from their control over state institutions, business organizations, and technological systems. These included high-profile politicians and business titans based domestically and abroad. Many others operated behind the scenes as insiders, played connecting roles as male and female members of merchant families, and served as boosters in spheres like journalism. Some coordinated the issuing of bonds and other financial instruments in European markets that enabled credit to flow more freely into Argentina's governments and businesses. The promoters had different and at times competing agendas, which occasionally resulted in conflict. Ultimately, however, their main goals proved to be sufficiently compatible and over time converged. These actors congregated at events like railway inaugurations, right? And this is actually not the inauguration. This is after a station has been built in Buenos Aires, but it sort of captured this. So to give it a sense of who congregated at these events, these railway inaugurations, let's take the 1864 inauguration of the Great Southern Railway, as it's called, a new transportation line funded by British capital that linked Buenos Aires city to a fertile ranching district called Chascomús. Here's Chascomús Station. Those in attendance included London-based representatives of the company, as well as Anglo-Argentine landowners who sought to profit handsomely from the venture. But it also included businessmen of other nationalities, domestic landowners, and Argentina's leading state officials. Men, I'll come back to this image if I can. Too far. Men like this man, Bartolomé Mitre, president of the Republic, for whom railways were essential to realizing visions of liberal progress and nation-making. He actually broke the ground with a ceremonial shovel at this ceremony. Now, the motivations differed between business leaders and state officials, but success at this time in terms of realizing these ambitions often depended on state-business partnerships. And in terms of the business community, this image of some Buenos Aires merchants from a slightly earlier time period with their top hats, they all look like Abraham Lincoln, right? Captures the sort of cosmopolitan mix in Buenos Aires. These guys would actually go on to found the country's stock exchange. Okay, so these are the types of people that I'm including among the growth promoters. Now, to open a country, which was an expression that was used widely at this time, to open the country in the imagination of 19th century expansionists, one needed to bring together the right people and the right mix of resources. But these ingredients alone were not enough. explosive growth also depended on assembling the right words, stories, and information. Instilling expectations of better things to come among domestic constituencies in Argentina was fundamental.
Para poder
No less
onde está o
important.
meu.
Portuguese? It's okay. Okay, so far-off foreigners needed to be enticed to part with their savings and would-be immigrants to uproot themselves. Not being a colony in a wider empire posed certain disadvantages for Argentina in this regard. Neither investors nor immigrants could be directly pressured to act by Argentinian state authorities, nor could they be made into captive audiences for propaganda. Instead, outsiders had to be courted and convinced, and in some cases deceived. This was the job of the boosters. So here I'm going to talk about one set of boosters. Actually, this is an image of this is from later in the 1880s, but it's of the scramble of different companies trying to, make you see who's going to win out in the race to capture sort of Argentina economically. Okay, but we're going to talk about these guys, not the actual newspaper sellers, but what they're selling, the newspapers, right? Newspapers are very important when it comes to boosterism in this time. And there are many different types of newspapers published in many different languages in cities like Buenos Aires, but few in Argentina could hold a candle to the Mulhall family in this regard. In 1861, they founded an English language newspaper in Buenos Aires called The Standard, which became arguably the most important source of commentary on a rising Argentina, one that was consulted by local elites, individuals of different nationalities, and overseas watchers in Europe. The Mulhalls also literally wrote the book on boosterism with the publication of the Handbook of the River Plate, which first appeared in 1863 and went through several reprintings in multiple languages. It was still around when I started doing research in graduate school. I remember I put together my first itinerary, I believe, on a very, very late edition. It became a travel guide eventually. A Spanish language edition was dedicated to the family's personal friend and president of the Republic, Domingo Sarmiento. Raised in a large Dublin family, Edward Mulhall, pictured here, left in 1852. Actually, this is Michael Mulhall, his brother, but they look similar. Left in 1852 for New York City. He decided to re-emigrate to Buenos Aires, province just 2 years later. The young man spent several years as a sheep rancher, eventually convincing his brother Michael and other siblings to join him and to try their luck in publishing. Like boosters of other nationalities, the Mulhall family saw themselves as working in the best interests of Argentina, but were not afraid of highlighting what remained to be done. An acute sense of competition with other expanding Wests shaped the Standard's editorial line. The paper kept an eye on other nations in Latin America and those further afield too. An 1874 article contrasted Argentina's advances with those in Australian and New Zealand colonies, warning that the British dominions could pull ahead thanks to easier immigrant access to land. Above all, comparisons to the United States, and here they compared Buenos Aires and other provinces to everything from California to Illinois to Texas, the list goes on. The comparisons to the US were the most important of this time. And not surprisingly, because the US represented to many boosters in Argentina what they aspired to achieve. We were talking right before the talk about one intellectual from this time period named Alberdi, who's now come back into fashion in some quarters, including among the current president of Argentina. If you read Alberdi, you'll see perfectly that a mix of republicanism that emphasizes European immigration, the need to invest in systems like railways, and also, not to put too fine a point on it, white supremacy comes together in a particularly potent cocktail, right? In fact, Alberdi talks about California in his most famous works, Las Bases, and he says that California represented a model of what he hoped to accomplish in Argentina, in part because there, Anglo-Americanos had replaced Hispano-Mexicanos on the ground, right? Those are the terms that he used. Now, the Mulhalls and others wanted to use pamphlets and lectures, as they put it, to puff up the country. And to this end, the very first pages of their first edition of the Handbook of the Rio de la Plata expressed with unshakable certainty that, quote, with an increase of population and industrial resources, the River Plate will soon follow in the footsteps of its great model, the United States. They claim that Argentina's natural potential rivaled that of the country to the north, adding for good measure, there is probably no country on the face of earth so favored by nature. Now, it wasn't just these flights of rhetoric, there was also an avalanche of facts and figures, because Michael Mulhall would become an authority, actually a global authority on computing economic data. The handbook was replete with tabulations of migration figures, shipping activity, commodity flows, even volume of postal traffic. Now, not surprisingly, this hard data reinforced the same inspiring conclusions about Argentina's future. Now, the handbook was the country's most famous guide, but it was not the only one. Just to briefly mention one more, Wilfred Latham's The States of the River Plate noted in almost erotic terms that in Argentina there existed a, quote, virgin richness and corresponding fertility, which only required the magic touch of capital to call forth abundant returns. His book also warned that this was a land of opportunity for men and Christians, as he put it, but that it required fortitude. There is an unquestionable El Dorado, he wrote, but it is for the industrious, the intelligent, the practical, and the enterprising. Now, over the years, the Mulhalls presented themselves as doing more than anyone else to improve Argentina's visibility. As with most of their claims, this was an exaggeration tempered with some truth. They published tens of thousands of copies of their paper. And what was important about this is that they were then sent to Europe, and European newspapers reprinted stories that the Mulhalls came up with. And some of the Mulhalls' coverage was in turn reprinted from the Spanish language press. But they were a key intermediary in this process. Right? So by the 1870s and 1880s, major London papers and financial papers were publishing stories from the Standard. And in the mid-1870s, the Mulhalls appointed their own London-based correspondent to report on financial affairs and to gauge opinion among movers and shakers. Thanks to the Mulhalls and also their counterparts of French, Italian, Spanish, Argentinian, and other backgrounds, these widening transatlantic networks of communications complemented the campaigns of state officials and capitalists to open the country by attracting more people, more imports, and more money. Now, it may be tempting to dismiss such appeals as mere puffery, right? But promotional campaigns had an ability to shape expectations that mattered to the viability of these ventures. Researchers looking into similar behavior today have come to the same conclusions. In fields like economics, long obsessed with mathematically sophisticated modeling, economists have acquired a newfound appreciation for the importance of stories to understand phenomena like growth. Recent studies in fields like narrative economics, one book in particular with that title by Nobel Prize winner Robert Shiller, takes pains to cloak their analyses in trendy concepts of virality, which they borrow from computer science and epidemiology, thus conveniently distancing themselves from humanities' expertise in narrative interpretation, likely dismissed as too soft. Sorry for the editorializing. Still, the realization that capitalist actors in realms like finance may be guided by contagious rumors and persuasive fictions about the future, which can lead even savvy investors to act according to self-fulfilling prophecies. This has garnered serious inquiry. New economic studies confirm what promoters in the heyday of 19th century expansion presumed all along, namely that certain strings of words repeated time and again with conviction and by enough individuals can have profound consequences. Okay, so here we have the growth promoters. Now, as it's clear so far, the growth promoters could not go it alone. Their ambitions depended on convincing potential investors, businesses, and migrants to take the plunge. We shall now turn to a second category of historical actors who were their intended targets. For sake of simplicity, today I'll call them the fortune seekers. Now, in truth, this is a bit of an exaggerated label. Some of those who pursued a rising Argentina were indeed hoping to strike it fabulously rich. Most, however, sought to secure a more modest measure of well-being for themselves and their families. These actors ranged from well-to-do bankers to impoverished laborers. But one thing they shared was that they were not merely pawns moved at will. They also cultivated their own information networks. Their money-making methods and aspirations reflected different notions of success, rooted in respective social backgrounds, relationships, and values. Accessing their experience is much harder, in part because they left behind a scant paper trail. But in my book, I try to find some ways around these obstacles. Take, for example, the foreign investors who purchased state bonds and company shares. They have a central, if somewhat mysterious place in Argentine history. The cross-border movement of capital is a topic with enduring resonance in Argentina and elsewhere. And in Argentina, it's featured in heated debates over imperialism and national development to this day. Yet if one asks, who were the foreigners responsible for these actions? The answers are patchy at best. The well-founded assumption is that much of the early capital came from British sources in the period that we're talking about today. Historical treatments tend to stress the end results of capital inflows, the total amounts of credit secured, the kilometers of railway lines built, etc. The result is we know little about the actual people who funded capital-fueled growth in Argentina. Now, this is an interpretive problem that's common to the history of many global South nations. Like, these actors are off-scene, I should say, and yet we know that they're highly influential. But there are some ways, in this case, of painting at least a partial portrait of the investor class. And one method that I've used involves the use of these types of records. And here I use quantitative analysis of these records. These are records known as Form Es. Now, all companies that were chartered in Britain were required to submit to the government a yearly report identifying their shareholders. There's no requirement in the United States, never has been. But in England, if you own company shares, the company had to supply a list like this to central authorities with the names, how many shares, the address, and some other information on each shareholder. These records may seem dry as dust, but surprises lurk within the registered books. Now, I've published some of these findings in a recent horror article, so I'm going to keep this part of the talk brief. If you want a copy, let me know. I can send it to you afterwards. But in a nutshell, the foreigners who risked their money in Argentina were individuals like this man, Friedrich Engels, co-author of the Communist Manifesto and shareholder in the Great Southern Railway Company. Odd as it might seem, Engels was the perfect example of the average investor in this Argentinian transportation company. In 1877, the Form E record identifies him as a gentleman by profession. One of the things listed in those records was profession, who owned 132 shares, which is almost exactly the average. Now, where did he get the money to do this? Well, during this period, as you may know if you know Engels' biography, he sold the family textile mills in Manchester. And with that nest egg, he invested in different things. Actually, we actually don't know the other areas that he invested in. We're lucky to know that he invested about 10% of the total in the Great Southern Railway. Now, despite his ordinariness as a shareholder, one suspects that no one else used Argentina investments to provide a subsidy to Karl Marx, who was then at work on the second volume of Das Kapital. Now, not all the surprises in the Form Es are that striking. But the shareholder records shed new light on other fundamental social aspects, including the gender dimensions of long-distance capitalism. Most histories of Latin America assume that the agents of overseas investment were male, and commentators regularly employ masculine metaphors of rape and penetration to describe the actions of foreign capitalists. Yet women had a significant presence in these British ventures. Of companies in Argentina, and these are 3 companies that I've studied in more detail, women were around a fifth of the shareholders of the Great Southern when it got started, a fourth of a tramway company founded later in the 1880s, and almost a third of all investors in the Buenos Aires Waterworks Company of 1890. Now, the shareholder records, in fact, if you want to look here at these records, we see that one guy there had a huge number of records. That was the Baring brothers. Ned Baring, Lord Revelstoke, as he liked to call himself, was one of the promoters of this company, so he owned a huge amount of shares. But here, if we look down further, we see 3 women named by the last name of Rolf, Maria, Anne, and Eliza, who each owned 1 or 2 shares. So here you can see kind of the scope of people involved and also the fact that women were involved. Now, on the one hand, women carved out a place as investors, in part due to status competition in Britain and the mounting need to earn additional income in the face of rising living costs and longer lifespans. On the other hand, the very categories designating women as economic actors rendered them visible only in terms of their marriage relationships with men. Female shareholders were identified in the registers. These were the occupations that were listed. Okay, I'm not making this up. Spinster, widow, or Mrs. Okay. They tended to own far fewer shares than men and had no direct leadership positions in the company. Now, in addition, I could talk, I won't in this forum, but about the geographic distribution of the shareholders, the class origins. We could talk about that later if you so choose. Now, there's more that could be said about these distant investors, but let's turn to another group of fortune seekers, no less important. That is the people who relocated to Argentina in search of wealth and opportunity. Increasing the numbers of European migrants in particular was essential to the era's dominant models of growth. For the promoters, everything from boosting land values to making the railways commercially viable to achieving supposed civilizing improvements depended on these demographic increases. Now, my book is not primarily concerned with the community life and ethnic backgrounds of each migrant collectivity, something which has been studied extensively in a vast secondary literature. Rather, my book centers on the means through which outsiders of many nations learned about the prospects in this rising country, how they sought to make and circulate money, and how they reflected on the frenetics of ups and downs of expansion. At one end of the spectrum were rags to riches cases like that of Ramon Santamarina. Having immigrated from Galicia at age 13, he started out working as a manual laborer before relocating to the frontier outpost of Tandil. Turning profits from a lucrative carting business and leveraging his friendship with state officials in the region, he began to purchase large tracts of land, including those seized recently from native chiefdoms. At his peak, Santamarina's holdings totaled some 500,000 hectares of land, and he branched out to become a leading industrialist and entrepreneur. At the other end of the spectrum were the great majority of immigrants who enjoyed far more modest material improvements. You can see them at a rancho, a hut here. To pick one individual, an Italian man by the name of Vittorio Petre, who settled in a farming colony in Córdoba province. In letters to his family back home, he warned that one needed patience to earn and save enough to buy land in this new country. Yet he boasted that there was ample manual work, and that one earned in 2 days more than what one could earn in 2 days. One earned more in 2 days in Argentina than one could in 2 months in Italy. That's probably an exaggeration, but that's what he was writing back to his parents. He claimed not to miss his old diet of polenta because there was plentiful fresh bread, meat, and other food. And here you can see one of the things that was driving a lot of activity was sheep herding in this period, one of the commodities, among others. Now, personal letters offer insights into the aspirations and diverging fates of those chasing a better fortune in a fast-growing Argentina. Indeed, positive reports like Petre's letters were sometimes reprinted by boosters, like shipping agents, to encourage others. In my study, I work extensively with the few surviving collections of such correspondence. Among the most intriguing is a set of late 1860s letters from this man, George Reed. He was a British man, but who lived in Portugal. His writings reveal how visions of the country's promoters clash with the realities of fortune seeking. Compared to other migrants, Reed had initial advantages, not only his luxurious facial hair, right? The kind of hipster beards that have made a comeback in recent times, going back to the 1860s and 70s, you can really see where they came from. All right, so he had initial advantages. He was accompanied by a business partner. They had pooled together a substantial capital of around 3,000 pounds, roughly $400,000 in today's money. So they weren't, poor migrants. They purchased land in a location in Entre Rios province, near Gualeguaychú, where there were other friends nearby that they knew. He had carefully done his homework by consulting the country guides, including the Mulhall's guides, and he read newspapers like the Standard. Things started well, but soon turned into devastating failure. During the first 2 years abroad, bouts of drought and then floods devastated Reed's animal flocks. A cholera outbreak killed thousands of people, and a political rebellion near Reed's ranch brought trade to a standstill. Reed struggled to rescue what was left of his initial savings. He came to the melancholic conclusion that the real wealth did not stem from the hard work of ranching. It came from the financial systems that enveloped pastoral activities and knit together long-distance capital relations. Reed said in a letter to his father, "Lending money is decidedly a better business than sheep farming." Now, in his letters, he vented anger at those he deemed responsible. He directed his greatest ire at one target above all, the Mulhalls and the Buenos Aires Standard newspaper. Quote from Reed, "It is a terrible shame the way in which people are induced in all sorts of ways to come out here with the idea that they're going to make fortunes. The editor of the Standard will one day be shot by the scores of men he has ruined by persuading them to come out, and it will serve him jolly well right." He also blasted countrymen who sought to integrate themselves into local society, berating an Oxford-educated man called Beckwith for, quote, turning Catholic and marrying a, quote, half-Indian woman who worked as a maid. These anxieties of degeneration were of a piece with the fears of going native expressed by Europeans in imperial zones across the globe. And such racialized prejudices about Argentinians came readily to the surface when economic opportunities soured, both by immigrants like Reed, but also in newspapers. Again, the point of narrowing our focus to individuals like Reed, or piecing together a collective portrait of the great Southern shareholders, is not to dismiss the promoters' visions of El Dorado. Rather, it is to illuminate the social features of economic life and the power dynamics of expansion that are missing from our current accounts of a rising Argentina. Making sense of steam age capitalism without coming to terms with its fundamentally patriarchal character seems folly, as does trying to analyze wealth-seeking without investigating the micro-social context in which its struggles took place. Expansionism in Argentina was shaped by the aggregation of personal appetites, group habits, and tactics for making one's way in an unpredictable world. From the combined consequences of moves like a distant investor purchasing company shares to an aspiring migrant venturing into the pampas grasslands. Okay, the third part here, we're going to turn to the third and final set of actors, those that lived in the shadows of growth. Now, these varied groups tended to face the brunt of the negative consequences of expansion in Argentina, as older ways of being were threatened and pressures of survival were more acute for them. Some sought alternative and at times ways deemed illegal ways of chasing fortune. My book considers a range of these groups, including different members of the popular classes and the indigenous populations living along the Republic's borderlands. To be sure, there's a vibrant secondary literature on some of these populations, but they are too often overlooked in histories of Argentina's takeoff, usually presented as mere victims or as even obstacles to modernization. Yet their economic lives are worthy of closer consideration, and my book analyzes how their behavior shaped the circulation of information and money essential for expansionist aims. Among those I address are the native-born groups called paisanos or paisanas, living in the main zones of foreign investment, commodity production, and immigration. These populations also went by other names. They were sometimes called criollos, Creoles. They were sometimes also called gauchos. Here's a one photograph to sort of capture, I have some others to capture what these populations look like in the eyes of people taking photographs, at least. Now, these local plebeians were distinguished by the rough manual work they performed, their traditional habits of dress, their mix of indigenous, Spanish, and African ancestries. These country folk were viewed often with suspicion by state authorities and settlers. We've got a group gathered outside of a pulperia, a tavern, right? Sometimes these pictures were taken for local color to entertain visitors and so forth. And my study considers both how these groups were disciplined by those in positions of power, but also how they adapted to the conditions before them, right? Many engaged in their own forms of migration to seek out wage work and other prospects. So there's a story of internal migration alongside the story of international migration. Here's some other the images, by the way. This is paisanas. I showed you the paisanos is a predominantly female group of individuals outside of another rancho. And then this is another image of how they adapted. Some paisanos adapted to new types of work, like railway building. This is a scene from Entre Rios, but the group of workers pictured at the bottom there on payday, or here, were from Corrientes province. Now, observers like Reed may have viewed, right, these populations and the fraternization between his countrymen and locals as a form of racial ruin. Viewed from another perspective, these encounters suggest that relations between local and fortune-seeking newcomers were not always hostile. There were also bonds of friendship, marriage, cultural exchange. Yet there was always an indebted tension to such encounters. Not surprisingly, because paisanos, right, for them, the making of an emerging El Dorado meant removal from lands upon which they lived and roamed, and also other forms of dispossession. Now, some paisanos responded with violence, including forms of theft that identified the weak spots in the wealth-seeking methods employed by expansionist interests. For instance, armed robbers targeted settlers in those moments in the transatlantic commodity trade when large amounts of cash were present. If you follow the money, this is one of the places you go. Most local and foreign pastoral capitalists entrusted their savings to banks, but some kept cash on hand because they distrusted financial institutions or because they needed currency to transact commercial deals and to pay their workforce. Some armed robbers were vicious. In 1875, an Italian family of sheep herders, comprised of 2 parents and their 4 children, were tortured to reveal the hidden location in their hut of 36,000 pesos, a sum recently received as payment. They were then murdered. Some crimes had a more dashing touch of social banditry. In that same year, another gang subdued a settler family, and the servant, quote, mulatto woman who was their servant, they took 82,000 pesos of the family's wool money, along with valuables and livestock. The outlaws made a clean getaway, though not before brazenly preparing an asado and enjoying some rounds of mate drinking while the family was tied up. Reports of violent theft and other crimes inevitably circulated through print, immigrant letters, and word of mouth. Boosters, like the Mulhalls, feared that without greater action, this bad press could scare off European investors and immigrants. But at other times, boosters used these reports strategically to pressure state officials into enacting certain policies they thought would be beneficial for growth. Now, the gathering pace of expansion in Argentina, and so I've talked a lot about the rural expansion, but the fastest growing places were actually cities, in particular this city, Buenos Aires. This sort of captures this. I also had to include this for Ariel because that confiteria you see there was called Confiteria Los Dos Chinos. So at this time, so a Chinese link even back then. So this was a climate that was ripe for other types of illicit behavior besides armed robbery, including frauds that were committed by locals and recent immigrants. Because this is a society in flux, with an ever greater number of unfamiliar faces entering the country, and with existing residents moving restlessly around the territory. The high degree of mobility meant greater anonymity. This rootlessness was most intense in cities like Buenos Aires, but was also a fact in booming rural districts. These places, full of new residents striving to make it, with business ventures being launched every day, with the profusion of currencies in circulation, these were a potential paradise for confidence men and confidence women of all sorts. Now, the common types of infractions included banking fraud, a crime as simple as forging a signature on a check, to more sophisticated cons. Other frauds involve tricking people out of their savings or dodging personal debts, often followed by flight into another province or overseas, in some cases back to Europe. A rising country was perfect for counterfeiters, too. These decades saw a wave of new banks created, both foreign-owned and public. One result was a profusion of different notes emitted by these banks, as the Argentine Republic lacked a single unifying currency. Figuring out the exact value of the banknotes in circulation, whether they were fake or not, was very tricky. Making money by making fake money was another route of fortune-seeking in such times of rapid growth. Now, one illustrative case was committed by a band accused of forging Banco de la Provincia de Buenos Aires notes in 1873, and these are the actual fakes. The alleged ringleaders were a career criminal named José Lafon, and his concubina, Catalina Douglas. The pair had bounced around Uruguay and Brazil, but soon saw the potential of Buenos Aires province. Lafon and a group of accomplices who were French and Italian came together to open a bakery in the town of Merlo, located a short distance from Buenos Aires city. Police agents suspected that Lafon was up to no good, claiming that he was making a public display of his newfound wealth. One police official noted wryly in a report that it was impossible to have, quote, earned that fortune from the bizcochos sold over the past 2 years. The scam was a family affair, as female relatives helped touch up the printed bills and painted on false serial numbers. When authorities raided the bakery, they found tools of the trade and later caught an agent circulating fake money among scores of businesses in Buenos Aires City. And we know this because if you go and you read the criminal reports of this era, as I have, there's my finger, you can see that these bills were attached into the police files. And so you've got the files, and often they will include an example of the counterfeited bills. They vary a lot in quality. Some, like this, are pretty fancy looking. And of course, I couldn't help but note there's a guy shearing sheep here on the bill, right? So connecting back to the pastoral sources of some wealth, but then also fake money as a feature of money in this time of growth. Now, these shady figures remain largely absent from our histories of economic life in Argentina, yet they too were part of the scramble. As financial expert Dan Davies has argued, the study of fraud can tell us something about the expectations that underpin mainstream capitalist practices. Such an approach is roughly analogous, he suggests, to how neurologists study rare head injuries to comprehend the more general workings of the human brain. Money-related transgressions such as financial fraud and counterfeiting depend precisely on subverting the mechanisms of trust that structured banking, commerce, and currency systems in a rapidly changing Argentina. Predatory as they may have been, these practices are further evidence of the wealth-making strategies that characterized a rising country. Okay, we're reaching a conclusion here. So that said, some of you out there, hopefully, may still be wondering about the merits of my admittedly wide net approach to expansionism in the social worlds of money and information. Well, I place these gaucho armed robbers and Buenos Aires counterfeiters in the same interpretive framework as the leading financiers of London, transatlantic capitalists, and the architects of the modern Argentinian Republic. So by way of conclusion, let me offer two justifications for my book's methods. First, this more comprehensive approach can shake up familiar habits of the mind, including outmoded conventions that divide the study of economic life from other historical genres. There's no doubt that the various interpretive turns since the 1980s have made an enormously valuable contribution to how we approach historical sources, analyze language, and deploy categories of social analysis. The new cultural history has given us so much, but it was accompanied by an unfortunate displacement of concern for the material aspects of power. At the same time, too much economic history gets written as if these cultural and social innovations never happened. There is no reason why post-turn tools for analyzing gender, sexuality, and race cannot also inform our study of economic life more fully, and not just for so-called subaltern actors, but also those who commanded positions over state institutions and capital. In the historical case I've selected, the classic story of Argentina's takeoff can be told in new, and one hopes more revealing ways, moving high and low and paying close attention to the relationships that structured economic behavior has certain unexpected advantages. For instance, delving into the criminal activity of some gauchos and counterfeiters can in turn encourage a deeper appreciation of the boundaries between licit and illicit behavior among other sectors. For armed robbers were not the only ones using violence to make money. So too were the interests that funded and led brutal campaigns against native groups and other populations deemed barriers to opening the country. Likewise, frauds were also committed by individuals in the ranks of the growth promoters, including crimes jarringly similar to those committed by the crooked counterfeiters of Merlo. Case in point is the 1889 scandal of the clandestine emissions. That's what it's called. And not to get into the details here, but what essentially happened was that bankers and politicians close to the ruling party tried to save themselves from the consequences of a financial bubble they had helped inflate over the late 1880s. And they tried to get out of it in the end by secretly and illegally printing more currency. Okay. And so here we have the Republic, right? It's actually called La Situación, but still about to be crushed by the las emisiones clandestinas. Now, these violations were not counterfeiting, but they were extremely close, the illegal printing of money. Their behavior ultimately had more dire consequences than those committed by fraudsters trying to pass fake bills on the streets. For this helped to really detonate the crisis of 1890, which was one of the worst economic crises in Argentina's history, and it helped to set off a cascading series of global financial panics. The US historians, 1893, the Panic of 1893 began in part as a result of Argentina's meltdown a few years earlier. Now, the second justification for my social worlds approach is rooted in my desire as a historian to show how the past informs the present. To put it bluntly, and at the risk of sounding grandiose, Emerging El Dorado seeks to make readers aware that growth has a human history worth deeper exploration. It is no exaggeration to say that growth is the defining issue of our times. Growth lies at the heart of humanity's most pressing predicaments in the 21st century. Everything from the global climate emergency to the future of democracy to the challenges of building more equitable and thriving societies. Here's another cartoon sort of captures this. Of course, researchers have explored many, many facets of growth in detail. Yet for all the benefits of drilling down on specific issues, a compartmentalized approach makes us take for granted the modern quest for growth on several simultaneous fronts. As we look into the future, there is a need to think in fresh ways about the connections between these different aspects of growth and how they help to create our current world. For most historians of the 19th and 20th centuries, however, growth is too often relegated to the background of our analysis. Its advances are usually narrated as an inexorable wave that somehow rolled ahead thanks to new technologies and abstract flows. We all too easily lose sight of the people involved. Steam age expansionism in places like Argentina was many things, but above all, it was a human creation, the product of individual aspirations, collective action, and group contests over the making and concentration of wealth. Thanks. Okay, so if you have any questions, feel free. No pressure, but I gave you at least some sense of what I'm trying to do in this book. And hopefully it's nearing completion. Yeah, that's sort of where I am now. So yeah. Yes,
Yeah,
Laura,
thank
please.
you for a fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it, and I was curious. You have so many wonderful photographs that are part of your presentation, and I was curious to know if the photographs and the photographers play any role in sort of information economy that's a part of your study.
Yeah.
It was striking to me that there are a lot of portraits, either individual or group, and sort of, what is the purpose of these photographs and sort of what role do they play in the
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. So some of these photographs I've had for a while. A number of these I've seen in other collections. There are a number of different collections that have been, Fundación Antorchas has brought out a lot of these that are about individual photographers. And on my most recent trip to Argentina just a couple of weeks ago, I spent some time in the AGN getting a lot of these reproductions. So I probably packed in too many photographs, but I couldn't help it. I've just gotten these. I wanted to look at them. Some are unattributed, so we don't know much about the photographers. Doesn't mean we can't analyze the images in more depth. There are a few that I use a little bit more. Oh, I went back too fast. So some of these were taken, like for instance, this one of the railway workers was taken by an individual I talk a bit about who left behind a diary with these photographs. But other images, most of these are unattributed, but let me go back to one that's one more. Yeah, so this one and the one that I want to show you, or that doesn't seem quite so eye-catching, this one, are attributed to a photographer by the name of Cristiano Jr. So Jr., he's got a very long Portuguese name. He was born, I believe, in the Azores, was a photographer in Rio for a number of years, actually took some, some of the early photography of enslaved people, right? So he's sort of, I think, famous in Brazilian circles for that. He then relocates to Buenos Aires, opens up a studio, takes portraits, but also takes images like this. We don't know exactly why. Maybe he was asked by the railway company to take these images. He's got a number of different railway stations. And in this case, I I talk a little bit about Cristiano Jr. in part because he was among those fortune seekers. In his case, he wasn't looking to buy land, he was looking to be a photographer. But photography was really important, in part for the tourist economy, but also, as such as it was then, but also in terms of getting out, images of Argentina. Now, it was expensive to reproduce images, but he did publish photo albums of what they considered, from our perspective, they're often really boring, and you're like, why do people find these interesting? Images of new railway stations, but empty of any people, because he had to take them early in the morning or something. So there are all these street scenes without any human beings in them. From our perspective, we want to see the humans, but then it was like, oh wow, the new railway station, the new government building. These sorts of things were sort of used as examples of sort of success. There are all other images that are used for other sorts of promotional purposes. But again, this is in an age before you could really have glossy pamphlets or social media types of images. So some of these were also taken by amateur photographers. There are some British landowners in the area of Chascomús, actually, and the University of San Andres has some of these images. I saw them on my trip just now to Argentina. They took pictures of themselves, basically. So they would take pictures of other British ranchers, occasionally of gaucho types for different reasons. Yeah. But no, the photography is super interesting. And I wish in some cases I knew more about certain images. And then I try to use other types of images from the time, like, for instance, this cartoon is caricatures from a publication from this time called El Mosquito. And they would do these really elaborate, it takes you like an hour to decipher what's going on here, but each of these horses has the name of a different company. There's a commentary here on the price of gold with the sword of Damocles. They're like really dense images. Some are a little bit simpler, but what's also interesting is sometimes these are the actual caricatures of the owners or founders of these companies. So in some cases, there are individuals that I've been writing about, like the Bering Bank representative, Nicholas Bauer in Buenos Aires. He features in part of one chapter, and I'm always like, what does he look like? And then one day I came across the fact that there was a caricature of it. So anyway, yeah, thanks. There's a tie there, so I'll let you
go.
Yeah, very interesting talk, and yeah, really does, I think, achieve the goal of putting humans back into the story of economic growth and economic development. The story about George Reed,
yes,
named after him, and the problems he ran into with the sheep ranch makes me wonder, and not that I'm asking you even to hazard a guess about this, but has anybody looked seriously or systematically at the rate of failure of various kinds of enterprises in Argentina to get a sense of what the risks were, how often those risks didn't pan out? The story that you tell really complicates things by showing that it's just not the inexorable wave of growth, that there are lots of catastrophes for people along the way. And I'm wondering if there's any kind of big statement to be made about that. Clearly risks are high, and I'm wondering, like, how high?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's very hard to quantify this in any way because, of course, these types of records were not kept. In part because it would have been very difficult to keep them,
Sure.
but also there was no interest in the Argentine government in keeping records of how many people failed, right? Why would you do that? Also, more broadly, there's a point to be made about quantification this period. Most of the metrics that we use to gauge growth were not used back then. And there's nothing wrong with economic historians who then recreate certain metrics like GDP and try to use them to calculate how much GDP was growing or not in this period. There's a value to that, but it was not what people at the time used or how they understood growth. They used other metrics, like, for instance, the volume of trade. The number of immigrant arrivals was one of the big metrics, both because it showed that the economy was expanding if immigrants arrived, and if immigrants left, that meant the economy was contracting. Think about public debate today in the US, if we use that as a metric of success, immigrant arrivals, right? It would give us a very, I think, different perspective on what's going on. So that's part of it. The other thing is I'm fascinated with the stories of failure because honestly, they're usually much more interesting to read about. Reed was a wonderful raconteur of his, and he had a bit of a sense of humor about it too. Even though he ended up basically at the end of the story, right? He says, I may need to pawn the watch that my family gave me in order to have enough money to pay for the boat passage home, right? So he faced some really tough circumstances. He happened to have really bad luck in that he was also in an area that saw the López Cordán uprising, which was one of the kind of last big caudillo uprisings of the 19th century. And so, but for that, he may have ended up doing okay, but he didn't. And so he was really great at talking about, blaming people. And understandably, we want failures and we blame others often for these failures. He blamed the Standard. He blamed the Mulhalls for falsely promoting the country. He blamed a bunch of other people as well, especially, as I mentioned, other Britons who then try to cross over into local society, right? Like that one individual he mentions. He criticizes another Briton for wearing chiripa, for having adopted the local kind of garb. So there are all sorts of ways in which he was sort of throwing daggers at people. There were some success stories. There's an Irish family that I look at called the Murphys, which I don't want to talk about today, but they have a much more even rags to riches story, arriving as immigrant laborers, eventually becoming quite wealthy estancieros. And he would often have more of a, maybe more of a sense of balance about failure. And he would admit, right, setbacks, but he would also say that, yes, the Mulhalls sometimes make stories up, but they serve a useful purpose. And so he thought that was okay. Then we have a whole other set of failures, which I do talk a bit more about in the last chapter of the book, about the 1890 crisis and the people who were understandably very angry that they were paying for the consequences of this financial crisis. And I also have, because these documents have been saved at the AGN, letters from financial insiders who detail all the different ways they try to wriggle out of responsibility, right? Including insider trading, influence peddling, learning about certain deals before they were made public, all sorts of behavior like that. And so that was happening too. So failure, it's an interesting thing because failure, I think, gets written out of a lot of the economic histories of this time in Argentina and probably also in other parts of Latin America. So it is one of those things that we have to sort of acknowledge. But at the same time, and this is one of the struggles of writing about Argentina, at times, because of Argentina's more checkered recent history economically, there's a tendency to want to, I think, assume that a lot of this was all BS. And so it's sort of like balancing the fact that some people did make wealth, but also that failure was definitely a possibility, and trying to see what we can learn from both. Thanks.
Thank you for a really fascinating talk. I have two questions that are very different. First question is, how do you choose your characters, people that you focus on? And I'll give you two examples. And made me think about when you talk about the railways and particularly sort of, you talk about the investors, but then you talk about the workers. It reminded me that my family, that part of it that immigrated to Argentina in around 1905. What we know is that for a while at the beginning, when they follow the construction of the railways, cooking for the workers. Mm-hmm. So they had their kind of independent thing there, and they will prepare food for the workers. So you have their, Jewish immigrants who spoke zero Spanish, mm-hmm. who, and I imagine that space, that place with, all these different people. And so that's one example, that there were all these additional people there, in that setting. And then it's fascinating your emphasis on, or your discussion on fraud, and it made me think about another aspect related to the Jewish community, which was, you know, human trafficking and you know, the prostitution ring. That I don't know if there are any. I've seen many studies of kind of the sociological dimension, but I haven't seen anything. Maybe there is stuff there about, for example, the importance of that enterprise in terms of economic growth, because as you know, as far as I've heard, for example, fortunes were made that then were the basis for some of the largest companies in Argentina that then became involved in aluminum production, rubber, I mean, big industrial stuff that started at that time and were really kind of engines of growth, if you want, but through illegal, you know, activities were also, you know, many sectors of the government and police, etc., were involved in that. So just as examples of, you know, that there are so many, you know, possibilities. How do you make that decision? Let me stop there, then I'll ask the second question.
I would say, so the short answer is, some of this is I'm motivated by the sources that I've been able to find. So where are the sources, the richest, for getting at the kind of social dimensions of money and information that I'm most interested in. Also, what sorts of aspects have maybe not been covered as much? So there's obviously a huge literature on the commodity trade, and I can't ignore commodities entirely, and I don't, because I deal with the sheep ranchers and stuff. But that's been covered so much that there wasn't necessarily that much of a need to go into that. I actually began thinking I was going to maybe limit myself to railways when I started this project many years ago. The sources are not there because, unfortunately, when the railways were nationalized under the Perón years, those records have subsequently been largely destroyed. Apparently, I say this apparently, hoping that they're in some deposito somewhere and that may be discovered. But all that stuff was trashed, basically. So we can't really, and if you notice, there are many famous works about the railways in Argentina, but very little about the workers on the railways, virtually nothing on the workers, the people who actually built the railways. And so I was interested in, as I began to do the research and ended up gravitating around, I noticed that there were records that were either financial, about banks, about the finance of railways, and then other records that were about money from below. And so that's why I ended up gravitating more towards trying to look at the high and low of money in this period, both the abstract financial flows across the Atlantic, but also what did money mean on the ground in a fast growing, rising country, right? And that's in part why I got into the counterfeit. Now, prostitution, sex work, call it what you will, absolutely was part of this growth economy. And I have a few examples from these criminal cases, right, where this will pop up. In terms of getting at some of the larger fortunes that were made, or the kind of white slavery story, there have been a couple of recent books that have looked at that, although not the economics of it quite so much. Maybe it's because those, again, we don't have records for that, or those records were later destroyed or never kept. I don't know exactly why. But certainly, especially in the rural areas, something like 2/3 of all immigrants were men in the early period, in the 1860s, 1850s. And that led to various types of services being provided to that largely male workforce, right? So there were the people who were cooking and so forth. There were people offering prostitution. There were other types of, services that were offered, and they appear in some of these records. So I try to at least acknowledge them. There's actually one memoir of an Italian immigrant called Pablo Guglieri, who got his start supplying food for one of the railways, and then ended up becoming a landowner. And so it's interesting to see his diary, because he was also somebody who went from a kind of laborer who then actually founded a town called Dero in Buenos Aires. Anyway, I think that's answered your question, but some of this is guided by sources. some of this is guided to the question though of illicit activity. This is, I think, another critique I can make if I could just lob critiques today, but critiques of the ways in which the economic history of Argentina has been told in that illicit activity gets removed. Right? That's for the social historians or cultural historians. That's not for the economic historians.
That's
Right? And yet, right, if you know anything about Argentina, these have to be examined together. And so that's why I think looking at things like the financial, deals and corruption is important, but also getting at the counterfeiters in part because they reveal something about the social texture of life in a fast-growing country and the ways in which scams like counterfeiting have existed in other times. But it was ripe for a counterfeiter. Perfect country for a counterfeiter at this time. No national currency, multiple things being exchanged. To use one example, one closing case of a prostitution example, I had this one criminal case of a guy, the owner of one prostíbulo who goes to the female owner of another prostíbulo next door and says, how much would you exchange 3 francs for in Argentine currency? They were doing these kind of currency exchanges all the time, right, on the ground. And you can kind of see that expressed in these documents.
interesting, very interesting. And thank you. And my other question is about the beginning of your talk, where you started talking about, that promise of Argentina, and then your choice of a use of the term El Dorado. And have you found sort of a, how do I put this, how different kinds of immigrants imagine, Argentina, decided to go to Argentina, and again, another personal reflection is that a part of my family, they were in Hamburg and they were going to the United States, and then something happened and they went to Argentina, and I would have loved to be able to ask them at that moment what was going on in their head, but I imagine that Argentina was maybe I don't know if it was second or that there were more networks, that they had family relatives in the US, but Argentina had something, in their minds. So because that idea of course, El Dorado goes back to the conquistadores, goes back, and connects to sort of the vision of the immigrant, how the immigrant constructs, builds that El Dorado, where they want to go.
Yeah, no, on El Dorado, it's one of the things I was struck by as I was doing this research, in that I would come across this term periodically. It's one of those things where you're doing research and there's a certain kind of bizarre term being used, and then you notice it in different places, and it sort of becomes something that you see, not so much among the immigrants, but more among the boosters, the government leaders. So I began with Roca in a letter to his brother, saying they see us as an El Dorado, right? Which is sort of an interesting move of this Argentine government leader using that term. But you also see it in the guidebooks. You see it sometimes used in the financial press, right? Especially in the English language press, but not exclusively, right? And what I liked about it is on the one hand, looking backward to these fabled riches of the colonial period. In theory, one of the things that motivated, right, the expansion of, Spanish colonialism in the Americas. And yet in this moment, and they see what they're doing as not as colonialism, the Rocas and the growth promoters. They see this as something completely different. Of course, there are lots of ways in which this was, of course, a form of internal colonialism, a form of even economic imperialism. But they're using that term El Dorado because it has some sort of resonance. And with the title of the book, Emerging El Dorado, I try to kind of combine our language and their language together in some sort of way. So I didn't see too much examples of the immigrants using El Dorado, although in the immigrant letters that I've read, they have their own ways of imagining this. So sometimes it's worth saying they end up where they end up, in part because they have a cousin who's gone there before them. So this typical immigrant story. In other cases, because where they live in Europe, the shipping routes go more to certain places than others. right? And in this time period, it's interesting. You have to think about Argentina and the Rio de la Plata more broadly as being connected on a line also with Brazilian ports. So the fact that George Reed ends up in the Rio de la Plata has a lot to do with the fact that he's living in Portugal, right? And is relatively close to some of those routes that are coming down from Basque Country, touching down in Portugal, and then heading towards the Rio de la Plata. So sometimes it has to do with that. There was one case I read in a newspaper, and this is sort of a funny one, I guess, tragic for the immigrants involved. Immigrants in Genoa were loaded onto a ship, said you're going to Buenos Aires, and then they end up that the ship takes them to New York City. And it's a huge scandal because they don't want to be in New York City. Because New York City, this is in the 1870s, for them, New York City is a much inferior location to going to Buenos Aires. Because the immigrant community, there still isn't a large Italian community in New York yet. That'll happen a little bit later. And so they want to go to Buenos Aires. And they're like, who's going to pay for us to go to Buenos Aires? We're stuck here in New York, right? So there are those kinds of stories. And in the letters, you see people expressing, they're the classic, Fare l'America of the Italian immigrants, where they call everything, including Argentina, America. Right? You see that clearly. But also in some of these letters, like the Irish family I mentioned, the Murphys, he's constantly translating sort of local situations into a language that the family back in Ireland will understand. And so he's saying it looks just like this, or this part of the country, or the sheep are just like this. Or you can find, there's this one, I can't remember the name now, brand of sauce. You can find that here. And so these are sort of things you might find in any immigrant community today, right? Those things that maybe convince you, oh, it's not so far. You can get the same sauce, the mail service improves. So, you can be in touch. From our standards, it seems we've got WhatsApp today. Back then, it's like 3 weeks for a letter was like, oh my gosh, only 3 weeks for a letter. But these things matter to people. So you see some of that expressed in these documents. And again, immigration historians, there's been a lot written about our immigration in Argentina, but not that much using these collections of letters of different nationalities to tell a story about how they circulated information and money. And in some of these immigrant letters, you see them operating as almost informal remittance services, as also placement services. So a neighbor in some town says, I want to send my son out. Sure. They were almost like indentured servitude, informal indentured servitude. You've got to work for me for 9 months, and then you can leave. So, you see these kind of arrangements in the documents. I'm sure I've probably gone on too long, but
No, I'm only glad that I get to have dinner with you because I have a few more questions.
Sure.
I hold you up, and I know that there's people that you are going to be seeing. So I just want to say thank you, and thank you, Dr. Elena.
please, thanks all.